So I'm talking about Kentucky Indians, right? So Kentucky Indians, the Siege of Boonesborough. Boonesborough is in Kentucky, right? It's an unincorporated community in Madison County, Kentucky. It lies in the central part of the state along the Kentucky River. Boonesborough is part of the Richmond-Berea Micropolitan Statistical Area. Boonesborough was founded by legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone when he worked for Richard Henderson and Transylvania Company. Boone led a group of settlers through the mountains from Fort Watauga, present-day Elizabethton, Tennessee, carving out the Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap, and established Fort Boonesborough. Boone lived there from 1775 to 1779. Boonesborough was the first chartered town in Kentucky. It's a chartered town, I don't know. Harrisburg was settled first, and one of the first English-speaking communities settled west of the Appalachian Mountains. Boone successfully led his fellow settlers during the Siege of Boonesborough in 1778. Boonesborough is the site of Fort Boonesborough State Park, which includes the Kentucky River Museum. It has been rebuilt to look like a working fort of the days when Boone resided there. Living History weekends are sponsored throughout the year. So the Siege of Boonesborough, you got Daniel Boone was captured by blackface. He runs away. They try him for having British loyalties, and he was later exonerated. Blackfish, they negotiate. He comes down with 444 Native Americans, mostly Shawnee. Again, the Shawnee. Blackfish was a Shawnee war chief. So the Shawnee war chief, Blackfish, called out to Daniel Boone out of the fort for a parley. He reminded Boone of his promise to surrender the settlement. Blackfish presented letters from Governor Hamilton which proclaimed that the settlers would be well treated and to be taken to Detroit if they surrendered. If they did not surrender, there was no guarantees. Boone told Blackfish that he'd present the offer to the others. He could not make it the decision himself, Boone said, since during his captivity other officers had assumed command. Back in the fort, Boone outlined the situation. The consensus was to fight rather than surrender. The decision was made to prolong the negotiations with Blackfish as long as possible since reinforcements from Virginia were expected. Boone and Major William Bailey Smith went outside again and told Blackfish that they feared that the trip to Detroit would be too hard on the women and children. Blackfish pointed out that he had brought 40 horses to transport those unable to walk. Boone asked for another day to consult the others. Leaders from the two sides smoked a peace pipe together and then broke off negotiations for the day. Over the next 2 days, settlers in the fort prepared for the siege. Based on faulty intelligence received from Hamilton and Detroit, Blackfish believed that there are at least 200 militiamen in the fort, when in fact there's only about 40 effective gunmen. The Kentuckians reinforced the illusion of a greater number of men by having some of the women in the fort carry weapons while dressed in men's clothing. On the evening of September 8th, Blackfish and Boone met again. Boone told a surprised Blackfish that the fort would not surrender. Blackfish proposed that a former treaty conference with all the leaders be held the next day. The treaty session began on September 9th with leaders from the two sides sharing a meal outside the fort. Afterwards, the council began. In case of trouble, both sides had gunmen covering the meeting from a distance. Blackfish demanded to know by what right had the white people taken possession of this country. That's Blackfish. Shawnee. By what right had the white people taken possession of this country? Boone replied that they had bought the land from the Cherokees at Sycamore Shoals. The Cherokee chief confirmed that this was true. Blackfish accepted this answer and then proposed that if the settlers would pledge their allegiance to the King of Great Britain, the Shawnees would accept the Ohio River boundary and both sides would live in peace. A treaty to this effect, which does not survive, was then signed. The Shawnees then approached the Americans to shake hands and seal the agreement. What happened next is unclear. According to one popular interpretation, the Shawnees, having failed to secure the surrender of Boonesborough, attempted to seize the American leaders. However, as historian John MacFarger and others have argued, there's little evidence that this is the Shawnees' intention. A scuffle broke out when marksmen from both sides opened fire. Despite a few injuries, the Americans managed to scramble back into the fort. The Indians rushed the gate but were driven back by heavy gunfire. Negotiations were over, but the formal siege had begun. The siege. Gunfire was exchanged over the next several days. After the initial flurry of shooting, Boone, who reemerged as the natural leader, even though as a captain he was outranked by Major Smith and Colonel Richard Calloway, urged the Kentuckians to conserve their gunpowder. At night, Native Americans ran up to the walls and attempted to throw burning torches onto the roofs of the houses within. This was ineffective, however, because the warriors made easy targets for the Kentucky marksmen. On September 11th, Antoine Dagneau de Quindre, in command of the Detroit militia, convinced the Indians to begin digging a tunnel from the bank of the river towards the fort, known as mining. The goal was to place barrels of gunpowder in the tunnel under a section of the fort's walls. When the barrels were exploded, the wall would collapse, leaving a place for the attackers to rush in. When the defenders inside the fort heard the digging, they began to dig a counter mine, hoping to collapse the attackers' tunnel prematurely. The diggers on both sides began to yell taunts at each other. Heavy rains caused the Indians' tunnel to collapse before it reached the fort. Boone's brother, Squire Boone, was known as an inventor. He fashioned a makeshift wooden cannon reinforced with iron bands, which was fired once or twice at groups of Indians before it cracked. Squire Boone also made squirt guns out of old musket barrels, which were used to put out fires on the roofs. The Shawnees launched their final assault on September 17th, again trying to set fire to the fort. They were beaten back, and the heavy rain helped to put out the fires. The Shawnees lost more men killed in this attack than on all previous days. The next day, they gradually broke off the siege. They separated into scattered war parties and raided other settlements, inflicting far more damage in their traditional mode of warfare than they had done during the siege. The two Boonesborough siege casualties. There's two Boonesborough siege casualties. The aftermath. After the siege, Colonel Richard Calloway brought charges against Boone, alleging Boone was in favor of the British government. Joining Calloway was Captain Benjamin Logan from nearby Logan Station. Logan and Calloway both had nephews who had been surrendered by Boone at the Salt Licks and were still prisoners. In the court-martial proceedings held at Logan's Fort, there was 4 charges against Boone. He said he had surrendered the salt-making party without a fight. While in captivity, Boone had promised to surrender Boonesborough to the British. After his return, he led the Paint Lick expedition, which weakened Boonesborough at a time when Blackfish's army was expected. Boone had exposed the officers to ambush by agreeing to meet the Indians at the peace treaty outside the fort. After all the testimony, the court found Daniel Boone not guilty and even promoted him to major because of his actions. Despite this vindication, Boone was humiliated by the episode and rarely spoke of it again. Boone then went to North Carolina to retrieve his family, who had returned there during his captivity, believing him to be dead. When Boone came back to Kentucky, he established a new settlement called Boone Station, rather than resettle in the place where he had been court-martialed. Boone Station was the home of Daniel Boone from 1779 to 1782. It says Boone's brother Edward was killed by the Shawnee in 1780 while hunting with Daniel in present-day Bourbon County. So Bourbon County. Bourbon County. Bourbon County. Never mind. But as Boone's brother was killed, Boone's 2 sons were killed. His son Israel and his nephew Thomas Boone were killed at the Battle of Blue Licks. So his nephew, his brother, 2 of his sons were killed. The Shawnee did not want you there. The Shawnee did not want you in their Kentucky lands. That was their lands. They lived there. That was their home. That's where their home was. That was their homeland. That was their Deutschland. So, Boone eventually lost or sold his title to his Boone Station land as a result of the chaotic, overlapping land claim system of frontier Kentucky. When, it's not exactly sure. In 1783, he either resettled his family in the cabin at nearby Marble Creek, where he lived for a couple more years, or relocated to Limestone, which is now Maysville, along the Ohio River. So, Boone could have lived in Maysville. Boone Station ceased to exist as a community by 1791. It is now a 46-acre Kentucky State Historic Site with numerous reconstructed cabins and stockade. Skilled staff and reenactors help interpret daily life at the station. So, that's the Siege of Boonesborough. I feel like Simon Girty was said to have been there too, but I'm not seeing Simon Girty anywhere. The Siege of Boonesborough. So, that's the Siege of Boonesborough. Something interesting about the Yuchi Indians is talking about the Yuchi language. The Yuchi language is a linguistic isolate not known to be related to any other language. The Yuchi people and language are featured in a chapter in Mark Abley's Spoken Here, Travels Among Threatened Languages, a book on endangered languages. In 2000, estimated number of fluent Yuchi speakers were 15, but this number dwindled to 7 by 2006, according to a 2011 documentary on the Yuchi language. The number of first language speakers has been reduced to 5. So there's only 5 fluent speaking Yuchi language speakers. Young people of the Yuchi learn the language, continue to do so, which contradicts what they just said. Yuchi language classes are being taught in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, Sapulpa, an effort led by Richard Grounds and the Yuchi language project. So whenever the Germans came to America, those who retained their German language, they were more loyal to the family, more loyal to each other. So language, common culture, having common traditions, common bonds, it all plays together. Their culture, right? Indian massacres were happening in America since Jamestown, since the very beginning. There's Indian Massacre 1622. Took place in the colony of Virginia, what now belongs to U.S. of A. Captain John Smith, even though he hadn't been there, and he wasn't a first-hand eyewitness, he'd said some lies. He said that the braves came unarmed into our houses with deer, turkeys, fish, fruits, and other provisions to sell us. Then suddenly the Powhatan grabbed any tools or weapons available to them and killed any English settlers who were in sight, including men, women, and children of all ages. Chief O. Petchenkano led a coordinated series of surprise attacks of the Powhatan Confederacy that killed 347 people, a quarter of the English population of Jamestown. So the Powhatan killed a quarter of the people in Jamestown, the first successful settlement in America. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was the site of the first successful English settlement in North America and was then the capital of the colony of Virginia. Its tobacco economy led to constant expansion and seizure of Powhatan lands, which ultimately provoked a violent reaction. Although Jamestown was spared due to a timely last-minute warning, the Powhatan also attacked and destroyed many smaller settlements along the James River. In addition to killing settlers, the Powhatan burned houses and crops. The English abandoned many of the smaller settlements after the attacks. Battle of Fallen Timbers is where it all ended. Battle of Fallen Timbers is the final battle of the Northwest Indian War, which was 10-year war in the 60 Years' War. So it went on for 10 years, but 60 years is when the Indian Wars raged on. The 60 Years' War from 1754 to 1814. So most of from 1750s on, the second half of that century, of the 18th century, was characterized by bloody Indian attacks, white settlers' attacks on Indians. I guess both. There's Indian wars, right? So Battle of Fallen Timbers was the final battle of the Northwest Indian War. It ended major hostilities in the region until Tecumseh's War. And Tecumseh's War was, I don't know, saying 1811, 1812, 1813. There's two major defeats in the Northwest campaign, Harmar campaign. General Hosea Harmar. Simon Girty was in here, is in these campaigns. I think he was. I can't be for sure. But Little Turtle, Hosea Harmar was fighting Little Turtle. In 1790, Hosea Harmar was sent on expeditions against Native Americans and remaining British in the Northwest Territory. After a few initial military successes, his force of federal troops was defeated by a tribal coalition led by Little Turtle in an engagement known as Harmar's Defeat. Later, Harmar returned with a somewhat larger force and engaged the coalition, but fought to a draw. It's also called the Battle of the Miami Towns. Consequently, he was relieved of his command and replaced by General Arthur St. Clair. Harmar was subsequently court-martialed at his own request on various charges of negligence and exonerated by a court of inquiry. So, Harmar's defeat, the Harmar campaign, was followed by the St. Clair's defeat, Battle of the Wabash, or the Battle of the Wabash River, or the Battle of the Thousand Slain. It was in the fall of November 4, 1791, Northwest Territory between the United States and the Western Confederacy of American Indians as part of the Northwest Indian War. It was a major American Indian victory. It remains the greatest defeat of the United States Army by American Indians. American Indians were led by Little Turtle. So Little Turtle was the one that was in Northwestern Indian Wars. There was a Little Turtle's War. So it was Little Turtle's War, just like Dragon Canoe's War. The Indians were led by Little Turtle, the Miamis, Blue Jacket of the Shawnees, and Buckong Ahilas of the Delawares, the Lenape, the Lenape. The war party numbered more than 1,000 warriors, including a large number of Potawatomis from eastern Michigan and the St. Joseph. The opposing force of about 1,000 Americans was led by General Arthur St. Clair, who had proved to be an able commander during the American Revolutionary War. The American Indian Confederacy was overwhelmingly victorious in proportional terms of losses to strength. It was the worst defeat that the United States forces have ever suffered in battle. Of the 1,000 officers and men that St. Clair led into battle, only 48 escaped unharmed. As a result, President George Washington forced St. Clair to resign his post, and Congress initiated its first investigation of the executive branch. So, Harmar's defeat, St. Clair's defeat, those are Indian victories, right?